Good evening and good morning. I think depending on where you are, all of you are very welcome to our seminar today. I'm Gi-Yuk Shin, Director of Schoenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. Okay, this is the third of our 4 webinar series on the perfect storm climate change in Asia. So we held the first one last month with the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. So if you missed it, you can watch online. Please go to our website. So as some of you may know, throughout this quarter, we will be looking to the climate change impact and risk in the Asia Pacific region, adaptation and mitigation strategies, and policy responses. So we will focus on specific geographic area or thematic issue. And today I'm very happy to say that we are going to talk about climate change in Southeast Asia. So next one will be on China, a week from today at 4 p.m., not 5 p.m., 4 p.m. in our time. So please check our website and join. So now I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, Don Emerson, who directs our Southeast Asia program. So he will be introducing our speakers today and moderate the discussions to follow. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, and please enjoy our presentation and discussions. Don.
Thank you, Gi-Yuk, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. I think it's going to be fascinating. It's certainly on a very contemporary and important topic. Viewed alongside other world regions, Southeast Asia is uniquely vulnerable to major damage by global warming. Its coastlines are lengthy and subject to sea rise. Its urban centers of economic and political gravity are mainly riverine or deltaic. Its agriculture requires optimal levels and rhythms of water flow, as do its polluted main veins, the Mekong, the Irrawaddy. In already tropical conditions, heat waves are especially enervating, nor has the region escaped extreme weather events. The 10 most afflicted countries worldwide in that regard include Myanmar, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. With this background in mind, Melissa Lowe and Angel Xu, 2 scholars with deep regional and policy knowledge, will consider how global warming is affecting Southeast Asia and what is being done or can and should be done about it. And a couple of introductions. Angel Xu founded and heads the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill's data-driven EnviroLab, an interdisciplinary research group that innovates quantitative approaches to pressing environmental issues. Her many publications include coverage of Malaysia, Vietnam, and especially China. In February of this year, she spoke on global climate trends before the US Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. She has appeared on an annual list of emerging leaders working on fresh, real-world solutions to the world's biggest challenges, global warming included. She holds a PhD in environmental policy from Yale. Melissa Lowe is currently researching the relative transparency of climate action and reporting in Southeast Asia. Earlier this year, she received Singapore's EcoFriend Award and its Public Service Medal for her work on climate change. She's on the steering committee that coordinates NGOs under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Her degrees include an LLM in climate change law and policy with distinction from the University of Strathclyde and an MSc in environmental management from the National University of Singapore, NUS, where she is pursuing a PhD in geography. Her master's thesis on the run-up to the Paris Agreement won NUS's Shell Best Dissertation Award. So you can see we have 2 very qualified individuals to discuss the topic. And Melissa, I'd like to turn it over to you to provide the information on Southeast Asia, and then turn after that to Angel to get the linkage between Southeast Asia and China with regard to this topic. Melissa, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Don. Right, just starting to share my screen. Okay, so good morning here from Singapore, but I believe it's evening over there in the US. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much to Dawn for inviting me to give this presentation. Today I will focus my talk on why the COP26 UN climate talk that's happening in about just over a week's time in Glasgow matters for the region of Southeast Asia. The term I use here in the title slide is ASEAN. Many of you might know this as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. I use it interchangeably in my presentation along with AMS, which stands for ASEAN Member States, but I'll talk you through it. So the last UN conference was in Madrid. It was called COP25 because it was the 25th meeting of the Conference of Parties to the Convention. And this was held in 2019, a long time ago, before the pandemic happened. And this upcoming Glasgow COP26 is happening nearly 2 years later. Southeast Asia and the region that Dawn earlier described has not wasted any time debating whether or not climate change is happening or what to do about it. And 2 years is a lot of time for countries, especially when they're vulnerable to climate change. As described earlier, Southeast Asia is home to some 640 million inhabitants, and many of whom do work and live along the coastline, which are of course vulnerable to flooding and tropical storms. So I've just put a map there, and you can see where Southeast Asia is on the world map. And even after accounting for the economic impact of the pandemic, because the region is so young and dynamic, most of the 640 million people are young people. We have across the region, if you take it collectively, the population pyramid is basically a triangle. So many observers, experts, including the International Energy Agency, expects that the region will require a lot of growth, will have a lot of growth, and this will require significant amounts of energy. And in fact, you see here in the slide, I've put that the GDP of the region, even after accounting for the economic impact and fallout of the pandemic, all the disruptions, lockdowns that have happened in the region, the GDP is still expected and projected to triple by 2040. So in 20 years' time, the GDP will triple. I move very quickly to Southeast Asia's diversity because this should form a foundation of what I'm about to share in my presentation. Southeast Asia is extremely diverse, both in terms of geography, but also national circumstances, meaning starting points when it comes to addressing climate change. So the two acronyms that I use in the title here, BURs and NDCs. BURs stand for Biennial Update Reports. These are transparency reports that all countries, at least in the developing world, have to submit to the UN Secretariat, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, every 2 years, starting, I believe, from 2014. And they represent progress, so at least the countries are supposed to highlight what progress they've made towards their targets. NDCs, I believe more people are familiar with. This is nationally determined contributions or climate pledges under the Paris Agreement. So if you simply study the reports, the biennial update reports, and the nationally determined contributions of Southeast Asian countries, you will see that across the region, the countries are so different, and it makes comparing them extremely challenging. So you have countries like Singapore, where I'm from, which is small and dense. We're also an island city-state. And then you have other countries in the region which have more than 40% of its total land area comprising of forest. And these are about 3 or 4 countries: Brunei, Laos, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Across the region, the sectoral contribution to the economy is also quite varied. So you have Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, and Myanmar that focuses primarily on agriculture. Indonesia and Thailand are primarily manufacturing based, and Singapore is export oriented. So this forms the economic bedrock of the countries, and that has implications on how they frame their climate targets. If these economies, or if these economic sectors are to be the drivers of growth, you will expect some flexibility applied to those sectors if they're covered under the NDCs, for instance. There's a typo in the second bullet point here, apologize for that. Some are small net importing countries like Singapore, while other countries in the region are large exporting countries like Brunei. They have lots of oil and gas, and others have a range of energy resources, including both fossil as well as renewable energy resource. And this forms the bulk of Southeast Asian countries. We also have a couple of least developed countries in the region, and these are Cambodia and Laos PDR. So when you look at these reports and NDCs, you find that not only do the national circumstances, geographically speaking, make it challenging for the region to address climate change, but they also face quite a bit of institutional challenges. These include issues like whether they have enough government capacity to produce reports and targets on time. And I'll come to that later. Producing them on time is a bit of a problem in this region. We can produce the reports, but they're not necessarily within the cycle that the UN expects. And sometimes what we have also is that there's confusion about which ministries and agencies deal with what issue: forestry and climate change, forestry and energy, and they move around a lot. And this region, as I mentioned, is very dynamic politically as well. And so in the past few years, we've had some political activity that at times might delay the issues being taken forward, at least in legislation. But what is clear is that energy is an important component in the nationally determined contributions across the region. Most countries in the region have energy-related targets, either in the form of energy emissions intensity, the way they framed their NDCs. And the headline targets, at least I've noticed, do indicate that most Southeast Asian countries want to pay attention to the economic development. So you might see the NDCs framed as an intensity target or relative to business as usual. BAU would essentially mean a policy absence scenario, right? And in general, you see it as a hockey stick or Nike tick kind of scenario where it's upward trending. And then some ASEAN countries just indicate a deviation from that in the NDCs or targets. As I mentioned earlier, energy is extremely important because it accounts for more than 57% or close to 60% of combined emissions of the ASEAN member states. And the second highest, as most of you can imagine, because I mentioned the issue of forestry, forest land earlier, the second highest emissions contributor is land use change, and forestry. So I looked at the updated and new NDCs, and for those who are not so familiar with the Paris Agreement, I'll just add some context here. Under the Paris Agreement, all countries need to submit and maintain a nationally determined contribution every 5 years. So each pledge, each target has to be more ambitious. But the wording is a little bit tricky. It just means there has to be a progression. And countries take that quite literally at times, and they maybe add one sector or they change a baseline and it's considered progression, right? So what we've seen, at least in Southeast Asia, is that most countries have submitted updated pledges. Brunei and the Philippines submitted their first NDCs this year, or I think late last year. Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand have announced plans to reach carbon neutrality or net zero, but by different timelines. So Malaysia has said it will do so by 2050 very recently in their 12th Malaysian plan. Indonesia says they'll do this by 2060, and Thailand somewhere in the range of 2065 and 2070. And so we see that there are many opportunities for ASEAN member states to prioritize renewables, and they have a range of them across the region. We see that this will require both government and private-led efforts. We already see some tools being used in the region to spur the growth of renewable energy resources like feed-in tariffs. And more recently, there's been carbon pricing mechanisms in Singapore. We're the only country right now that has a carbon tax, but there are more countries that have already started legislative processes to initiate a carbon pricing mechanism. But there are significant challenges that slow the low carbon transition in the region, and this includes the structure of energy sector. I mentioned state capacity earlier. There's still some energy subsidies at the pumps in the region, and is extremely political. There is a relative abundance, and coal is also very cost competitive, so it undermines the growth in renewables and reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. There is a general absence of carbon price, but this is changing. And there's continued investment in coal power plants, not just from the countries themselves, but particularly foreign direct investment. And I believe that this will be covered later on. And I just highlight here that most of the NDCs, not Singapore's, but most of the NDCs in the region include conditional targets, where the countries have said that they will increase their emissions reduction targets if there is international support. And where are we going to get this international support is the question to ask. So there are many open issues going to COP26, but I think the most significant one most of us are familiar with is Article 6, or the market and non-market approaches to addressing climate change. And in the slide here, you see our Minister for Sustainability and the Environment, Minister Grace Fu, along with the Norwegian Minister for Climate and Environment. They've accepted the invitation to co-facilitate ministerial consultations on Article 6. And these remaining issues on the table, I believe there may be more, or they're not nuanced enough, basically are the politically contentious ones. And those of you who have been following the talks, if you just look at the Madrid text, so basically the negotiating, the L draft coming out of Madrid COP25, you'll see that actually we're pretty much there in terms of Article 6, but there's some political issues like how to avoid double counting, whether we can transition some Kyoto mechanism units from the clean development mechanism and into Article 6, and whether or not that would undermine the post-2020 emissions reduction. How do we allocate share proceeds? Right? So there's talk of 2% of each transaction going towards adaptation of climate change, and that's also pretty political. And finally, there's the issue of whether Article 6 mechanisms actually contribute to overall mitigation in global emissions. So just a key highlight. We can go into it in Q&A if anyone's interested. But this is important for the region of Southeast Asia because we see a growth in the voluntary market development in this region. So I mentioned Singapore has a carbon tax, but we don't have a cap. And so this means that our carbon market is actually voluntary. And the rest of the region is also piloting some of the climate credit systems, or we call it. So carbon credits trading in the region is already being done. And Japan is one of the big countries that's offering some pilot schemes under the JCM, or joint crediting mechanism, which I believe they hope that will have some elements included in the Article 6 mechanism. So the region has not been sitting still at all. We've been using these past 2 years to actually develop expertise and capabilities, practice how to trade carbon emissions in order to meet potentially our targets by 2030. And as we know, these targets have to be ramped up over time. I mentioned biannual update reports. This is an area of interest for me for my PhD. So I'll go through it very quickly. Essentially, Annex 1 or developed country parties have to submit reports too, but they call them biannual reports, so BRs. Developing countries call them BURs, okay, biannual update reports. And the rules are slightly different. How I would characterize it is that the team of experts that look at the developing country biannual update reports are a little bit more flexible. The rules are non-punitive. So it means that they don't pick on the countries and ask them to do more if they cannot do more, because we know that capacity is limited. So I just want to say here that the ASEAN countries have, while they have not been submitting them necessarily on time, you can see here in this slide that they've really tried their very best to submit these documents, and they are very rich in information. So if anyone wants to go and study Southeast Asia or are studying Southeast Asia and have not looked at these BURs, we strongly encourage them to do so. So it's important to see that you also in general see the relative capabilities across the countries in the context of transparency reporting. Over time, it's important for them to improve the reports. And these reports, in fact, also get them more funding over time, because if funders and investors can see what countries are doing, if they can see economic potential, green growth potential, if you might want to call it that, then they might go and invest in these countries. So there are multiple benefits of submitting transparency reports in ASEAN across the world, but specifically in ASEAN, because they require so much development funds in order to leapfrog out of the fossil phase into renewables if possible. Because Laos and Cambodia submitted their first BURs in 2020, they have triggered a process of international consultation and analysis, and they will be presenting their first BUR at the Facilitative Sharing of Views at COP26 very, very shortly. So I believe it's the 4th of November, and this should be webcasted or available on the UNFCCC YouTube page. And you'll be able to see the presentation slides and download them from the website, the UNFCCC website as well. But we don't end there. Under the Paris Agreement, we are moving towards an enhanced transparency framework. So this means that we, from 2024 onwards, the countries across the world, not just Southeast Asia, will have to move to a new framework, a new set of guidelines, where they have to submit more reporting requirements. And I don't have time to go into this, but I believe what this means is that more training will have to be done, and more capacity building will have to be done, because you see the rate of submission isn't great in the region. It's improving, but it isn't great. The region of ASEAN so commits to this group called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And I just want to mention here that there's something called the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation. And there is an overarching aim of the region to achieve a renewable energy target of 23% and energy efficiency target of 30%. And so ASEAN does play a role, maybe not so heavily a role as the European Commission in the EU, but it still does play a role. And some of you may be familiar with something called the ASEAN Way. It's a principle of non-interference in this region, and it does account for some of the, perhaps you might say, slower pace of regional cooperation. I mentioned this already, so I'll just skip through it. Usually these are opportunities and political forums for countries to highlight some of their challenges and coordinate towards meetings like the COP. Singapore was chair of the ASEAN Working Group on Climate Change back in 2018 as chair of ASEAN, and we hosted a special meeting in Singapore. And yeah, so these meetings are obviously no longer, well, they don't take place in person anymore, but I just thought to mention it here. Another picture with Patricia Espinosa, who is the executive secretary of the UNFCCC. So I'm coming close to the end here, but I just wanted to highlight that there's quite a fair bit of cooperation across ASEAN. Like I said, extremely dynamic region, and one of the cooperation angles is Smart Cities Network to digitalize and ensure that there are bankable projects across the region. Yeah, so I'll just skip right through this because I know we are short on time, but I just wanted to say that there's one of the more important things we might want to pay attention to is also the jobs that might be lost through the decarbonization. So a lot of the jobs in this region, including in Singapore, is still primarily in the shipping, oil and gas sectors. And in moving to renewables and a low carbon economy, we are already seeing jobs being lost, and we're not upskilling and reskilling enough quickly. So so this is my set of conclusions. I'm happy to take this up during the Q&A a bit later. Thank you again very much for your attention and for inviting me to share. All right.
Thank you. Thank you. That was extraordinary. Quite a tour d'horizon. That was just amazing. All right, Angel, it's yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Don. and I will get my slides queued up. Well, thanks so much, Don, for the invitation to join this panel, and thanks so much to Melissa for setting the scene. I always really appreciate being on a panel with Melissa because she really is the foremost expert when it comes to the negotiation. I feel like she's been to at least a dozen or so of these climate change negotiations. And so she's always my go-to person to figure out exactly the nuts and bolts of what's going on. So I was recently living in Southeast Asia. I lived in Singapore for 5 years. And while I was there, I started a project to look at overseas implications of China's climate policies and influence through its Belt and Road initiatives, which is a multi-trillion-dollar development program that China started in 2013 that has involved massive infrastructure development all across the world, but particularly in Southeast Asia. So this photo that I have here is taken by one of my students in Lao and Luang Prabang in the northern part of the country. And it's one of these rail projects that was financed by Chinese government funds. And so this project has been asking, well, what are the climate change implications of China's overseas investments, particularly when it comes to urban infrastructure development and land use change? It kind of got a little bit of a halt due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then I moved back to the United States, but I'm really hoping that I'll be able to pick it up and actually have some findings for you next time we talk. But for this evening, Don asked me to really talk about the role of China in Southeast Asia's climate policies. And so I've studied China for close to 2 decades now, and my dissertation was focused there. I lived in Beijing for many years. And so I just wanted to structure my comments in 3 key parts. First, to just give an overview of China's own climate change commitments and what they've pledged and what we might be able to expect out of their position at COP26 in just a few weeks. And then secondly, I think that the first part about China's own commitments and what we might anticipate them to say at the Glasgow summit has been shadowed by China's recent energy crisis. And I think that has implications for Southeast Asia's climate policy. And Melissa and I were talking before the webinar started about how Singapore is also experiencing an energy crisis. And so how countries balance the need to secure short-term energy supply and energy security with these climate goals. And I think the international pressure to ramp up the ambition of these climate goals, I think this is something I would love to debate with folks on the call. And then lastly, my idea for how we can enhance cooperation between China and Southeast Asia on climate change is actually for China, since it's shifting and stepping out of the role of financing overseas coal to start to finance overseas renewable energy projects. And so I think this is an area that has huge potential. As Melissa said, Southeast Asia definitely needs that investment. And it's a way that also I think that China could compete with the United States for inspiring a race to the top on clean and green energy finance. So my first slide here is just a quick review of China's pathway or roadmap to achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. And so Xi Jinping last September 2020, at the UN General Assembly, made this banner announcement that the country was going to commit to carbon neutrality by 2060 or sooner. And this was really huge for 2 reasons. One, China was the first developing country to make a carbon neutrality target. Secondly, I think, and this is a point that Melissa, you and I have talked about a lot, is that this was not necessarily a very typical place for China to make such a banner announcement about climate change. And I think it really set the scene and precedent for what we heard just a few weeks ago at the September General Assembly meeting this past year, just a few months ago, for them to commit, again, another climate change related statement on stopping overseas financing of coal. But some people have criticized this target and saying, well, the science through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that we have to decarbonize by 2050 or earlier in order to keep that 1.5 degree Paris goal in check and within reach. And so some are saying that 2060 is too late, especially for the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. But it's quite ambitious. And I think we're still waiting to hear more details about how China will actually get to that 2060 carbon neutrality goal. And so they have this target that they set as part of their Paris climate change pledge. And so that's the NDC, or nationally determined contribution, that it would peak its emissions by 2030 or sooner. And so Tsinghua University, which is a leading university within China, has developed this scenario that you see here on the left. And so essentially there is an enhanced mitigation scenario that we're hoping we'll hear some more details about at the COP26 negotiations that will imply a tougher 2030 NDC target, maybe even an earlier peak of emissions. But even still, to achieve this 2060 carbon neutrality goal is going to require a 16-fold increase in solar energy, a 9-fold in growth in wind power, and increasing nuclear by 6 times, as well as doubling hydroelectricity. So it's no small feat for China to already ramp up its globally shattering statistics in installed solar, wind, and nuclear, and also hydroelectricity. We thought that we would hear some more details about the 2030 roadmap when China announced its 14th five-year plan. So that's the time period covering 2021 to 2025 that was announced at the 2 sessions meeting this past March. But it disappointingly, and I think not all too unexpectedly, didn't actually provide any of those details. So the 5-year plans, they actually take many years to consult and to formulate. And so I think some were disappointed that it didn't actually include some of those details and increase the ambition of that 2030 peaking year target, and also China's original Paris pledge. But I think that this does leave some room open for more clarity in COP. And so China, I think, likes to seek these key moments when we least expect it, oftentimes, for them to make these types of commitments. But at least last December, President Xi Jinping did make an announcement that China would commit to increasing its non-fossil share of energy from 20% to 25% by 2030, as well as increasing solar installed capacity to 1,200 gigawatts, which is absolutely enormous. And so I think that there are still some indications that China is not over yet, and they're not done yet with making these types of commitments and increasing the ambition. So this is really the ambition COP. It was supposed to happen last year, as Melissa said, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, they've delayed it. And so I think a lot of the conversation at COP will involve trying to see what countries are willing to put on the table now that they've had that extra time, and also the pandemic, to reset and think about what they can commit to moving forward. But I think one piece that really threatens that conversation at the same time that I'm also optimistic is the fact that China and many other countries around the world are experiencing energy crises. And they could definitely threaten China's announcements at COP26 to go even more ambitious, even though Premier Li Keqiang has not said that, and has instead said the opposite, that China needs to ramp up and accelerate climate action to deal with the fact that current sources of fossil-based energy, for example, coal power, are simply fundamentally incompatible with a 1.5 degree world. And if you take a look at this map here, about half of China's provinces had to ration electricity amid a nationwide coal shortage. And so this is largely due to the policies that China has put in place to reach its climate change targets. So they're known as the dual control targets, where they at one hand set, and you saw this in the previous slide with the 14th five-year plan, where they set targets related to both intensity-based metrics, so allowing energy and carbon, for example, to grow, but just slow down the rate of that growth, but then also setting absolute caps on both energy and carbon. And so a lot of people are blaming these energy caps for the power outages, particularly happening in southern China, in Guangdong, for example, which is one of the most populous provinces in China, where there's been soaring energy demand because of unexpected warmer and hotter temperatures that kicked up demand for air conditioning. And so that's caused these coal shortages and made it more expensive for power plant operators utilizing coal to operate, since these electricity retail prices are set by the government and not by the market. And so because of that, it's just simply become too expensive for them to operate and to recover some of those operational costs. And so that's led to many of them stop running and causing forced outages. And it sounds like this is something that has similarly been happening in Singapore. And because of the fact that China's electricity is still pretty much fired by 60% coal, then this has really threatened China's ability to provide for a solid baseload power and left millions of people without power. And so I think that certainly this is going to be part of the discussion at COP26, because China's not alone in facing these energy crises. And so when countries are thinking about the clean energy transition and decarbonization and abandoning their fossil-fired power bases, I think they're going to be looking towards China and seeing exactly how China responds to this crisis in the short term, and whether or not it will have any implication on their long-term plans for enhancing the ambition of their goals. And so I think that's a really key point, and because China has set some, has kind of pushed or taken their foot off of the brake on coal to address these short-term outages, I think that certainly calls into credibility some of their plans to enhance the ambition of this 2030 roadmap. And so I think that's something that we certainly should keep a watch out for. Oh, and I found this amazing map from Bloomberg, which basically shows to meet these coal shortage demands, China's rerouting global coal supply chains. And so it's actually importing coal from many countries that, and normally China is a net exporter of coal, but they've been having to import coal. And so this is one of the routes that coal from Kazakhstan has been taking to reach Zhejiang on the eastern coast of China. So yeah, it's a pretty dire situation, but I think that this is something that the world cannot afford for other countries to follow suit who are experiencing similar energy crises. And so I think it's important for China to just emphasize that despite these energy crises, that they're not backing down from their climate change commitments. And I'm hoping that they'll still provide more clarity about the 2030 roadmap and this enhanced mitigation 2030 scenario. So that's one thing that I'm going to be looking forward to. But to my second point, and Melissa also alluded to this as well, I think the challenge for Southeast Asia is much more challenging, particularly from the energy demand side, because you take a look at this figure from the International Energy Agency. These are their scenarios for Southeast Asia and the growth in primary energy demand, and also the mix of those different energy types from 2018 all the way to 2040. And you can see that the share of coal in red is simply not backing down. And so that's something that is quite troubling. And also, as the IEA notes, coal consumption in Southeast Asia, if we look at the past decade, it has more than doubled, with the largest growth happening in Indonesia and Vietnam, followed by Malaysia and the Philippines. And so it's one of the few regions in the world where the share of coal in the power mix has increased. And coal demand, as we can see from this data, is still projected to rise steadily over the coming decades. And so that's one of the reasons why China has been one of the primary financiers of coal projects in the region, because the demand is growing and the demand is there on the part of Southeast Asian governments alone. And so China is a major financer. Nearly a third of the total 245 billion in energy finance is going to the Asia Pacific region. And of this funding, 3/4 is financing oil, gas, and petrochemical projects. Coal is only about a quarter of BRI financing. And even though these investments have been falling over the last 3 years, due to the COVID-19 pandemic and simply, and a lot of, and Melissa also alluded to the fact that the policy context is also changing in Southeast Asia, it's still quite significant. And so also in these databases, you can see this is also the Southeast Asian region. And this shows, again, the demand for coal-fired power plants in the region. And so researchers at Boston University have recorded over 29 gigawatts of coal power that have been built or planned in Southeast Asia. So that's about a third of the US's total generating capacity. And oops, oh no. Okay, here's the slide I meant to go. And so you can see from these data here that China, in their financing of overseas coal, is financing many of these projects in the Southeast Asian region. And so between 2000 and 2019, China's development banks invested, I mentioned this, says 235 billion, but another figure is 245 billion US dollars, with coal about a quarter of that. And so Indonesia, India, Vietnam, Pakistan are the top 5 recipients, and also Bangladesh. So many Southeast Asian countries are here as recipients of this overseas financing. And the reason why, this is a really great paper from Kelly Sims Gallagher at Tufts University, where they actually interviewed policymakers and looked at policies on the books for energy plans and development in the region. And you can see here, I think this table is just so striking, that in the Southeast Asian countries, and also South Asia and India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Bangladesh, they all have explicit preferential policies for coal. And so in almost every case, it's the demand is coming from Southeast Asian countries. And in some cases, renewables are actually disallowed by regulation from competing with coal on a level playing field. And so together, these 4 countries alone are adding 160 gigawatts of new coal-fired power from now until 2030, according to their respective energy plans. So I think that this really helps to explain why there has been so much financing from China into Southeast Asia fossil-fired electricity projects. And I think the major question now is because China just recently has vowed to stop supporting new coal-fired power projects abroad. What will happen to these projects in Southeast Asia and these preferential policies that prioritize coal-fired baseload power over other forms of energy? And so I think that's a major question that hopefully Mel and I can debate, and I think will also be an important topic to dig into at the COP26 negotiations. And so just briefly here, right now, the pledge for China to stop the construction of coal power plants affects about 44 projects in various stages of development. And so one of the key questions is whether or not these projects here will be affected by this new ban on overseas projects, or whether or not it only applies to new projects. And then whereas the restrictions apply to the development banks in China, so there are 2 major development banks that are supporting these projects, I think another question is whether or not the rules will also refer to privately financed projects or to other project developers that may still be interested in meeting that demand coming from Southeast Asia. But as Melissa also mentioned, the policy context in Southeast Asia is really changing. And so now many of the countries in Southeast Asia are looking towards the science and thinking about how they can increase the ambition of their NDCs and also enhance the ambition of their climate policies. So Laos, for example, has already declared a 2050 carbon neutrality target, which is really incredible. And in Cambodia, Myanmar, Bangladesh are also considering 2050 net zero targets. And then other countries are also working on their enhanced ambition NDCs. And so we might see some of those being announced in the coming weeks at the COP25 negotiations. So I think with this changing policy context, it will be a major question as to whether or not the demand will fall for these coal projects. We've already seen some slowing demand in Vietnam, for example, but also with these targets of increasing renewables to about 23% of power generation in the ASEAN region. I think these 2 policies hopefully will continue to drive decreases in demand for more coal-fired power, because simply we can't have this region and China continue to build coal and expect to achieve our climate goals. And we see that the cost of some of these technologies, particularly wind and solar, are becoming more competitive, although still, as you can see from this figure, that coal is still quite cheap in some countries like Malaysia and Indonesia compared to other forms of renewable energy such as solar and wind, onshore wind here, and even gas for that example. And so I think this is an area where China can really help by actually helping to provide some of the technology and the infrastructure development to uptake more renewable energy that the Southeast Asian countries currently lack. And so I think this is an area where China can really shift. Whereas they were financing infrastructure development to support fossil fuels, I think that they could really try to shift those investment to help the ASEAN region actually build the infrastructure so that they can really ramp up and lower the cost of generating electricity from renewable energy sources. And so there is a huge opportunity to do so. This is coming from the same Greenpeace report. And so they looked at the future opportunity for renewable energy investment in the Southeast Asian region. And so the coal, I think this is a very clear figure, although I don't love pie charts, but this is a really clear figure where you can see that the investment for coal power from 2010 to the present, only 77 billion, but then there's a huge potential for growth in investment in renewables. And already the last several years, there's been, I think Greenpeace reported like a 1,700% increase in investments in renewables from China over the last few years. And so I think that if China can continue to invest, I think we can definitely see those numbers increase. And so I think that this is one area in particular where China can compete with the United States. So as the United States is trying to reassert itself as a global leader on climate change and exert influence overseas, on clean energy, I think this is an area where China actually has a competitive advantage because they're already manufacturing 2/3 of global solar panels and half of all wind turbines. And so I think this is an area where China could actually really outcompete with the United States. And then one model, Don asked me to think about particular innovations. And so Melissa talked about the regional frameworks that are already in place with ASEAN to cooperate on climate change. But I think that one of the most interesting financing models that I've come across is the idea of these debt for nature swap or debt for climate swap agreements that are becoming more popular. And so there were recently two reports that were written looking at the potential of this model, particularly for the Southeast Asian region. So the idea that China could actually try to buy up, or an NGO, for example, or other type of creditor, for example, could actually buy up some of the debt from the fact that China has lent a lot of these Southeast Asian countries money to build up this fossil fire capacity. They could actually buy up some of that debt in exchange for these countries actually investing in climate policies, mitigation, adaptation, or more renewable infrastructure. So I think that there could be a lot of potential in this kind of model. So I'm going to be asking when I'm at COP26 negotiators from Southeast Asia and also China, particularly on this question, and because I think it really has a lot of potential. And so this is a figure from this paper in Science, for example, where they were making this argument for these debt for nature or debt for climate swaps. And these are countries that could stand to benefit the most. And so they did this analysis of these high potential areas. And you can see two countries in Southeast Asia, both Laos and Cambodia, are primed for these types of arrangements. So I think that this is really innovative and could shift some of that investment previously that China has made in fossil-fired electricity generation infrastructure to renewables, and at the same time compete with the United States. So I think it's kind of a win-win-win on all fronts and could inspire this race to the top on climate change. So I know I went massively over time and Don's instructions to keep it short, but had a lot to say on this topic. So thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you. That was terrific. I mean, the combination of the two presentations is just outstanding. It's just what I wanted. There's a synergy here between the emphasis on Southeast Asia and then the role of China. I have a comment and two questions just to kick off the discussion. And, you know, I don't want to make this a hub and spokes where you're the spokes and I'm the hub. I want it to be a triangle. And so, Melissa, if there was something that Angel said that you have second thoughts about, or vice versa, please. I hope you can engage each other. But as a layperson, I have a comment and two questions. My comment is, without trying to create a gap between the two of you. That's my last intention here. Nevertheless, it seems to me, if I had to characterize your two presentations, I would say that Melissa is a cautious optimist, and Angel, except for your ending, which really opened up into a very kind of positive view of possibilities lying on the horizon, I would say that you were a cautious pessimist, particularly with regard to, the export of emissions from China, although we know that that is changing. At least China has promised to change it. And I'd like you to resist that characterization if you wish. That's the comment. And then I have two questions, one for each of you. If we could start with Melissa. Now, the interesting thing is that there are levels of analysis. Here we have COP26, right? This is way up in the stratosphere, right? I mean, these are the movers and shakers coming from all over the world, engaging in long discussions. How can I put it? The distance between that and a miner in Kalimantan, digging coal, is massive. And in between, there are all kinds of actors. Melissa, you referred to the problem of decentralization within a bureaucracy where, who deals with climate change? Is there one ministry that is in charge? Well, no, it's the Ministry of Infrastructure, or the, Ministry of Industry, or a financial ministry. In other words, getting from here to there involves a large number of individuals who may have rather centrifugal ideas. and pet peeves and interests moving in different directions. So if we kind of introduce the more kind of human and even political element into this, would it be fair to say that in Southeast Asia, leaving aside the possibility that ASEAN can play as a kind of overarching structure, I don't want to underestimate their role, although frankly, most people I think who look at ASEAN today are not impressed with its efficacy, but that there are three matters that are absolutely crucial in Southeast Asia. One is clarity, the second is transparency, and the third is a word that perhaps doesn't crop up so much, I don't know, in these discussions, enforcement. The emphasis is on incentives, of course it is, right? Especially market incentives, right? Here in the US, we're kind of relieved to know, partly thanks to China's production of solar energy, we're delighted to know that solar is actually cheaper in some sense than oil, or at least it is certainly now with the oil price, of course, zooming sky high. And so it seems like incentives win almost without even trying, right? But the issue of enforcement, of transparency, of clarity, rather than just general statements that by this year, we will have some percentage, right? And of course, by the time the year arrives, the people now who are concerned with it, some of them won't even be alive. So what would you say if the Secretary General of ASEAN were on this call and said to you, Melissa, okay, great, but what's the nitty gritty here? How can I construct a regime that will motivate people, but also make them accountable? How do we introduce accountability into this effort to combat climate change in Southeast Asia? What would you say?
Oh, well, thanks, Don, for the question and your insightful comments. I would say I think that the premise and the design of the Paris Agreement was so that countries come forward and be at the table to negotiate and to participate in its mechanisms, rather than sit it out. As you can imagine, many of the ASEAN countries, and I mentioned this using the example of transparency reporting earlier, many of them didn't start until, well, really when the rules were agreed, right? So 2014 was the deadline for the first biennial update report, and transparency, there have been some papers on this, and it doesn't always lead to greater accountability, but that's what I'm hoping to study a little bit more in the context of Southeast Asia. In an ideal situation, when you are more transparent, you have baselines and you capture the greenhouse gas information and the data. In principle, it should lead to greater accountability because more people have access to that information, and you can then hold whichever ministry that administers the sector and the legislation to account. But of course, as I had also mentioned, it's tricky because these shift, right? So the persons or the teams in charge of those particular sectors do shift. And we've seen that in Malaysia, for example, very clearly when they moved from the Pakatan Harapan government to the Perikatan Nasional, where three ministries were combined into one, the MESTEC under Minister Yobi Yin. When the new government took over, they then split the ministries back to three. And so coordination was completely lost, mostly lost in that situation. So there are glimmers, there's some hope in the region that we've seen how things can work in an ideal situation, but then we seem to be taking sometimes one step forward and two steps back. And I think we have to live with some of this going forward and backward for, within this decade for sure, as countries start to internalize the new rules. The Paris rulebook was only agreed in 2018, and then we still have some remaining in Glasgow. So we have to remember that as the rules are being developed, many of these ASEAN countries, the same people that are going to COPs that are actually doing the work back home. And they still need time to internalize the new rules and to transition away from the old set of rules into the new set of rules. And all of this takes away time and effort from their daily work. And it's just a lot. And it's more challenging when you don't know who you report to at times. So it's tricky to explain it because one would need to have a particular country in mind to explain. But what I'm seeing is that as countries submit more of their transparency reports and their NDCs, you see a commitment to an institutional arrangement or structure that would be a clear upward trajectory or hierarchy of information. And in principle, like I said, I think that should increase accountability, not necessarily enforcement. I think that's another issue, because who would enforce emissions, emissions essentially, if, like I said, those sectors are important for economic growth and poverty alleviation and so on. Yeah,
well, I mean,
it's a long way
about,
to.
Forgive me for interrupting. What about horizontal enforcement? Of course, this is a misuse of the term enforcement, but so we're sitting around. I mean, if I remember your slide on number 11, if I'm not mistaken, it says that Myanmar, Brunei, and the Philippines have not yet submitted, as far as I can tell, a single biennial update report. So let's say I'm in Laos, which we can get into in a moment, because I'm really struck, the facilitative sharing of views, the role of Laos and Cambodia there. I mean, I'll get into that in a minute. That's interesting because, of course, Laos is not the most muscular economically, or for that matter, politically or militarily, member of ASEAN. But here we have Myanmar, Brunei, Philippines, who have not submitted a single biennial update report. So I'm Laos. And at a meeting, I look across the table and I say, hey, you folks over there on the other side of the table, what the hell are you doing, right? Get your act together. We all need to work together. I mean, what defines the climate challenge? It goes beyond individual interest. It's the interest of everyone, right? And it's no longer a long-term future challenge because the fires in California, I could go on, including in Southeast Asia, floods. This is a matter of crises and emergencies right now, today. So couldn't there be, I mean, you've been to many of these meetings, a kind of horizontal effort of, you've got to step up and do the right thing, or am I being naive? I'm probably naive, right?
My sense is the absence of reports, primarily two factors. One is funding, lack of funding, and the second is leadership. So I think many of us know where President Duterte is coming from when it comes to climate change. Excuse me. So in terms of the Philippines, they've chosen to focus their efforts and their position on adaptation. And I think it's always strange timing, not strange necessarily, but this is always peak typhoon season going into COP. And usually the Philippines, whenever they're at the COP, there's some form of disaster. And so in general, I would say my observation has always been that the Philippines, the last few years under President Duterte, has chosen to focus. And my sense is that the negotiators' hands are tied when it comes to channeling resources into reports like these, right? So they're just not given the funds and the time aside to do this work. The second is, again, if I might draw the attention back to then Minister for Environment in Malaysia, Yeo Bee-yin. She went to a COP, I believe, can't remember exactly which one it was, but I think it was in Katowice probably. And she, at the high level segment, said, we're wasting too much time filing funding requests for the BURs, for the transparency reports. And she was going through the resourcing of her team back home. And because there's no national budget assigned to transparency reporting, they have to keep putting up papers and tenders and interviewing consultants. And then when the consultants are done with the reports, they leave. So the capacity is not even in-house. So I think the struggle really is we have to recognize that capacity has to be built and maintained. You may have to pay people enough, to be doing 3 or 4 persons work, because you're not only managing your own legislation in your sector, but you're also managing international requirements that are becoming more and more, there's more pressure on countries. And don't forget, when you have reports like these out and published in English, you actually attract more investments and funds. So it's sort of a vicious cycle, right? In some ways, if you don't allocate national budget.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. No, fair enough. I realize the complications of decentralization and so forth. And I'm in the middle. I should perhaps add as a footnote, some of you may be familiar with this book, The Ministry for the Future, which I don't know if either of you looked at, but if there's any lesson that one draws from that, and it's political science fiction, so it's not really relevant to an academic conversation like we're having, but nevertheless, it does suggest the possibility that solving this problem will require a concentration of power, which, other things being equal, means that decentralized accountability could end up just being red tape, blocking progress. On the other hand, obviously the role of democracy in trying to resolve the problem becomes a tremendous issue, and that would perhaps take us far afield. But the second question I had, if I may, directed to Angel, is in a way not so much a question, but it's an effort to ask you to elaborate a little bit on the vision that you ended with. We often talk about China's search for a sphere of influence in East Asia, or more broadly in Asia. I guess some would argue, perhaps prematurely, in the world. And often that sphere of influence idea has a negative association. China dominating, China manipulating, and so forth. And one looks at their behavior with regard to ASEAN, and China has not exactly encouraged the unity of ASEAN, perhaps because it's easier for them to deal bilaterally with each of the members rather than to face all of the 10 members across the table. That would take us to a different place. But what struck me about your presentation toward the end is the possibility. I mean, Laos here is really interesting, because Laos is not a major actor. But if we go back to Melissa's slide number 12, the facilitative sharing of views, Laos is right out there in front, together with Cambodia. And Laos, of course, is smack dab next to China, and is considered to be one of the most pro-China, or almost a client state even, of China inside ASEAN. So is it possible to imagine, this is kind of weirdly positive given all the negative vibrations one associates with some Chinese behavior, that China will establish a sphere of influence that will in fact lead the way and provide the incentives to the Southeast Asian countries, including economic incentives, you already referred to some, to actually do something about climate change, so that Southeast Asia, with the support and maybe even the leadership of China, could become a major zone in the world, not just adapting, but actually mitigating climate change. Or am I being naive, and am I carrying your idea too far?
Well, I just want to defend myself and say I definitely am not a pessimist. I think most people who know me know that I'm an eternal optimist, a stubborn optimist, and I think you have to be working on these issues, because working on climate change is not a sprint, it's a marathon, and you have to show up every day, and you have to find the bright spots and think about how you break past so much of the intractable inertia in climate policy and governance and action. So I think that's certainly the hope. And I think going back, I think even to Copenhagen, that was the first COP conference I attended in 2009. China was already starting to step into that role of being a leader in developing countries on climate change, and starting to actively direct financing overseas to developing countries, including the Southeast Asia region, least developed countries, to help them adapt and mitigate to climate change. So that was something that was really surprising, because if we go back to 2009, that was a major sticking point for the United States. And so you had the United States saying, look, we are not going to agree to this target of $100 billion annually starting in 2020 to help developing countries, non-Annex 1 countries, adapt to and mitigate the effects of climate change. And they said specifically because they didn't think that China should be privy to that financing coming from the developed world. And China, in a major departure, they had been holding steadfastly to this position that they're actually a developing country, and they should not be beholden to the same requirements as the developed world. They said for the first time, we know we're going to step up. We just want to advocate for developing countries to be the recipients of this aid and to hold the developed countries like the United States accountable to this commitment that they need to make. And so since then, China has launched South to South cooperation funds, and every year at the COP, they always up those commitments, and they showcase the counterparts in these countries who are recipients of this aid. And so I think it's just natural that now the tides we're starting to see shift away from overseas financing of coal in this region. Now more countries like Laos and we also saw Thailand are considering target, and Cambodia also carbon neutral targets. I think that if those long-term targets are set, and that's the whole reason of trying to galvanize these countries to think long-term for decarbonization, then that sets the framework in place for then these countries to know where they need to get. And that's why I started the presentation talking about China, because I think they actually do provide an indication of some of the pitfalls and the challenges that Southeast Asian countries will need to consider in shifting their energy mixes, which still are heavily dominant and reliant on coal, away from coal, oil, and natural gas to renewables. And so, yeah, I think there are a lot of lessons for China, and they have so much of the technology that has made it cheap and affordable for the rest of the world to adopt more solar and wind capacity, that it just makes sense for them to also export those technologies to Southeast Asia to drive those costs down. I think in response to actually your first question to Melissa, to me, we can talk about the rules of the Paris Agreement, we can talk about the framework, but I think it's going to be the economic incentives that are really going to push the scales in Southeast Asia. Once they see that it's no longer cost competitive, also if you factor into account the social costs of burning coal, that it just does not make economic sense. I think many other countries have come to that conclusion. I think Southeast Asia will be close behind, but we need that help from China.
Well, that would be very good, because, you know, if it's a rational motivation, then you don't really need enforcement. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, if I could, for some reason, there doesn't appear to be, oh, wait a minute, here might be a question. Well, but perhaps I could, while I'm looking at this question, it's rather a long one. Let me ask a question of my own. This is a radically different topic, but, you know, it is what it is. And that is to say, okay, so the economic argument, fair enough, right? That economic growth is actually going to be possible. It's going to go along with protecting the environment, maybe even do better because of that. Fair enough. What about the following notion that success against climate change will not be achieved unless there is what might be called chronological empathy? Because let's face it, you know, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years from now, there'll be a whole new generation that will be experiencing the consequences of whatever the decisions we happen to be making right now. Yeah. I mean, to put it, you know, in somewhat extreme terms. So here the question is the younger generation in Southeast Asia, for example, or for that matter in China, so seized of this issue that they're saying to their elders, look, you've got to do something about this. And that it's not just a question of centralization at the top, in which the elites make rational decisions about mitigation, but pressure from the bottom. Is that happening in Southeast Asia? Is it happening in China? Can it be fomented? Or am I being naive and sort of exaggerating the role that the younger generation is likely to be able to play?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably Melissa can also speak to this, but when I was based in Singapore at Yale and US College, the students organized the very first climate change rally in Singapore in 2019. And that was incredible. It was incredible, just being as a foreign observer. And I think Melissa can provide the Singaporean perspective. But to me, that was really highly unusual because one, these types of protests are not commonplace in China. Or in Singapore. And like I, as a foreigner, could not even participate. I was kind of just like looking at it from Twitter because I couldn't actually participate as a foreigner in Singapore. But that was a direct, I think, it was just such an inspiration to hear so many youth come together and to make this statement. And they had this one demonstration. It was like, what was it, like a climate death or something?
A die-in.
Die-in. Yeah, that's and so was it like mimicking the number of people that die every single year due to climate related impacts? And that, I think that was really powerful. And I mean, I just think that the global youth movement has, and I have noticed a change in the conversation. I attended Davos in 2020, right before the lockdown, and their focus was on sustainability. And I can tell you that the single most popular person out of anyone. President Trump was there, and Angela Merkel was there, and there's always like celebrities like Bono and whatever, Matt Damon, who's there. The single most popular person was Greta Thunberg. I mean, it was crazy. You could not even get into any of her events. There were people who were falling over themselves, getting selfies with her, like 65-year-old men were like, oh my God, I got a selfie with Greta Thunberg. And I'm like, she's 17, man. Like, you know, but and I think that just speaks to the power of, and just the moment that the youth have had in engaging the climate change issue on an international stage and really getting in the ear and the faces of policymakers and corporations. And I was just at the TED Climate Countdown Summit last week, where there was a very tense confrontation between the youth and one of a Shell oil executive. And it was, I mean, I think these kinds of moments are really of just showing how important the youth are taking this issue. And yes, I do think that policymakers are listening, but maybe Melissa, you can speak more to the Singaporean response.
Yeah, I was at the first ever climate rally in Singapore back in 2019. Well, it was great, and to just give some context, yeah, these protests are not common in Singapore. In fact, you have to take out a license in order to stage something like that, and there's also a police station right next door. So you have to apply for a license with the police station, and as Angel said, foreigners are not allowed in. They were sitting at the periphery, but you need to show your pink identification card in order to get in to the protest. And so it was not. There were about 2,000 youth, I believe, on site. And in fact, there was also some issue with the way the press had reported it. I believe a number was put up and then taken down by the editors at some point. I don't know whether it's to disencourage or disincentivize people from going, or to stage protests in Singapore. In fact, I do know anecdotally, I'm involved with the youth council in Singapore, and they were pretty concerned about whether the Fridays for the Future and the strikes would take place as well, right? Because kids would basically be arrested if they and they have been, sad to say, but so human rights have actually sort of bled into the climate movement in Singapore, and I can only imagine that this might also be happening elsewhere in the region. But I did want to say that we've also seen quite a bit of progress in terms of the way young people are speaking up about climate change and climate action. I think some of you may be aware that Singapore is home to quite a number of oil majors and petrochemicals, and there were a couple of incidents in I think 2020 around staging of protests and in front of the oil majors' offices, for instance, and in the heartlands of Singapore. My understanding about this is that young people are anxious about the future. I think as Donald mentioned, this issue of the decisions that are being made today having a huge impact on the youth of today being leaders and people of tomorrow is starting to hit home. And there was a big piece in the Straits Times just this weekend about eco-anxiety. And so young people are actually calling for more action. I think that governments across the region are still trying to understand how to communicate with Gen Zs and millennials. And the way in which that advocacy is done, at least when I started my work in research and to some extent outreach and advocacy, was really just to write research papers, to write commentaries, and gently nudge, gently push. But today things are so different, right? They stage protests, sit-ins, die-ins. They write letters directly to the members of parliament. That's not wrong. It might be seen by some people as wrong or not very tactful or not very effective, but it is effective, to my knowledge anyway. It does get, sometimes it gets civil servants scrambling, and I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. At least when it comes to climate action, it does make people feel like the issue is extremely urgent, and it is. And I think we're just trying to figure out the best way to sit down and negotiate and have an exchange.
Right.
Meaningful exchange.
I think it's getting near the end of our time, but we do have a question that I would like to, if I could, paraphrase and extend just a little bit. The question is about ASEAN, not just the ASEAN member states, but about ASEAN itself. And I think it would be fair to say my interpretation of the question is that it is predicated on the notion that ASEAN can really play an important role in combating climate change in Southeast Asia. And, you know, if we look back just the last few days, we see that Myanmar, right, Min Aung Hlaing, right, the dictator, the head of the junta after this incredibly bloody regime has murdered, what, over 1,000 of its own citizens. I mean, a horrific situation. And ASEAN basically accomplished nothing, although they did have the 5 principles and so forth, but they were essentially ignored. And then, lo and behold, they decided that Min Aung Hlaing could not come as the head of the Myanmar delegation at the East Asia Summit. And if there's a causal connection between that and the recent release of over 5,000 political prisoners in Myanmar, that would make it interesting. In other words, it would see, now we don't know what ASEAN is going to do, whether they will let him back in as the head of the delegation or not. But what I'm trying to say is that it's possible to imagine that ASEAN is getting a little tougher and therefore perhaps more suited to play a significant role, not just convening meetings, but actually trying to do something effective that would improve the kinds of trends that the 3 of us are trying to encourage in Southeast Asia with regard to climate change. And so the question is, what could China and the United States do to incentivize, that's his term, incentivize ASEAN to play an important, effective, constructive role in this problem? It's a broad question, and we may not have time to get too deeply into it, but that's what I'd like to close on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, really tough question. And I mean, I think that for me, and looking at the COP26 negotiations, to me, the most influence that US and China can have on ASEAN is by setting a good example. And I think particularly for the United States in the international climate change arena, they have a lot of work to do to repair the loss of trust and credibility that happened the previous 4 years before President Biden took the role of presidency. And so to me, that is the number one thing, the fact that major emitters like the United States and China, which comprise around 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions, that they're serious, that they're back, that they are committing at a very high level and all the levels in between to addressing the climate change issue seriously, that this isn't something that we can back away from. We've set these long-term goals with Biden now setting also a 2050 goal. And yes, the politics within Congress are complicated right now, clean energy standards, but I'm still hopeful. Mm-hmm. And then also China as well, with even in spite of the energy crisis, if they don't back down, I think leading by example and working, not necessarily having to work together. I think that we can still accomplish our climate goals if China and the United States still compete and have this race to the top, as I mentioned in the last part of my comments. Mm-hmm. But to me, that would be the big one, because there really was, and I think Melissa can speak to this as well, where the last 4 years, the presence of the United States was a joke at these conferences, and it was really frustrating being an American, frankly, and just seeing that the United States delegation was organizing clean coal panels, for example, at a climate change summit, and just not really meaningfully engaging. And so I'm going to be looking out for that. And thankfully, a lot of seasoned diplomats, and John Kerry's also back in the helm as the special envoy. And a lot of my friends are back in the State Department negotiating for the United States. So I have a lot of hope that that's going to help to influence ASEAN and help to turn the tides. But I think that's the single most important thing that the 2 countries could do.
Yeah, that's really good. Melissa,
I just wanted to, I'm sorry, Don.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with Angel. I think the US being back in the Paris Agreement is significant, and this is the first COP that they will be back. And to be honest, I don't know whether it would, I hope it doesn't distract from the key issues that have to be finalized at COP. You know, because there are a lot of headline, there's a World Leaders Summit now that's taking place quite at a strange time, right? So usually the high level segments towards the end of the COP, but this time the UK decided to put it on the 1st and 2nd of November. And usually the first week is where the key negotiations take place. So I don't know how the staffers are going to move around and make sure that they're ministers and heads of states are comfortable, and while they actually have to be in negotiating rooms at the same time. So hopefully, like I said, doesn't distract. I just wanted to add that I put a report on the state of Southeast Asia in the chat box for everyone to take a look and download. And I'll just point out that the funder of this report, incidentally, and they worked through the ASEAN Secretariat, it wasn't either the US or China, it was Japan. So I believe that ASEAN has many more partners than just the US and China. And we are definitely seeing a lot more cooperation with ASEAN and partners like Japan and even Norway. They've set up a project in Jakarta at the ASEAN Center for Energy, for example, and we see a lot of interest in the region, to help integrate climate and energy issues. And so while I think that US and China should absolutely lead by example, there are many other countries that are offering assistance, help and support to this region, and we certainly shouldn't also forget them.
Yeah, good. Well, I think it's appropriate that we end on a relatively optimistic note. That's good. That's really good. Okay, well, listen, thank you so very much. I've really enjoyed this. I've learned a lot. I mean, I really have. And I'm very grateful to you. And I wish you both the best. And I wish you success. I wish COP26 success. And hopefully we'll be in touch again down the road. But thank you so much for your time, your intelligence, your expertise, your knowledge, and your engagement. Appreciate it very much. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.